Hello, guys, and welcome to my Seattle Seahawks 7 round mock draft. Excuse my appearance, I was up late binge watching a show last night. Obviously, the Seattle Seahawks, I think, have a good amount of picks in the early 100. I think they have like three or something like that. They're in a very good situation, given that I guess they have their QB of, the future potentially. In Sam Darnold. I still think that they need necessary pieces around him. I do not think that, we'll look at it. The additions of Cooper Kupp and MVS are going to be like, oh, this is going to be who we are. This may work for this year. JSN, obviously, a true beast and a baller and a difference maker. He's the only one that they've hung on to, out of the three that they had, and Metcalf and Lockett and him. Looking at these other guys, they've obviously addressed it, a lot here. I do like Jake Bobo. Jake Bobo to me was, kind of a producer when he got limited playing time, obviously, type of thing. But obviously on the O-line is the biggest need. You beat Sam Darnold from a guy who had a pretty good O-line in Minnesota and wasn't pressured a whole lot, to having this one. And it's like, Charles Cross, I think, was improving last year. I think he did a very good job. I also think that, with a better offensive scheme or better decision making from the quarterback, they'll be less exposed as well. It goes both ways, but otherwise, looking at left guard, center, and then right guard and right tackle. I mean, Abraham Lucas, jury could still potentially be out on him, maybe not, type of thing. But it's like overall their O-line was kind of, iffy last year. Sometimes very good, but in the run game, it wasn't very good. Running back is definitely somewhere I don't think that they'll touch. Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, obviously, being a very good tandem when healthy in the NFL. Looking at their very good defense, to be honest with you. Leonard Williams, Byron Murphy, Jaron Reed has been, popping. DeMarcus Lawrence, I think, is a very solid pickup for them. While he's not the player that he was, I think he brings a very good leadership to this kind of younger team. And it's like him and Leonard Williams are kind of the vets here. Ernest Jones, who was a very solid pickup last year and just showed that he belonged in Seattle. As their weak side linebacker, like him. Tyrus Knight, who they drafted last year, clearly high on him to have him starting as a 4th-round pick. Uchenna Nwosu, I'm just not sure whether or not, and I think that edge is definitely somewhat of a need. I think they can get pressure with the guys they have and that sort of thing. But then it's like looking at this cornerback room, we've obviously got Witherspoon and Woolen. Woolen, to me, who is interesting because, like, sometimes he just doesn't look like the kind of speedster that he was that came out of the league and gets beat sometimes, but I think he's, fine, and another year, his second year in this system after they hired McDonald as their head coach. Julian Love, great. Kobe Bryant, I like, but they could, look for safety help, so it's like looking here, I think what you could address on defense is maybe safety, line, edge, I don't want to say linebacker, edge, but then potentially, I guess, to be honest with you, maybe a corner if there's someone you like, just to have a bit of depth there. And then offense, we have wide receiver, O-line, all the way from left guard to right tackle. Tight end, potentially, if you have a guy you like, even though I think Noah Fant is a fine receiving tight end. Nothing spectacular, but will get open and will get yards. But without further ado, we're going to start the draft. And as we can see here, they have 10 picks. And 5 in the first 100. Goodness. I knew that it was very, very good. Now looking here, when we get to their pick at 18, kind of looking at this, it's like, who do we have that went who do we have that went? I mean, definitely interesting. So I think that edge is a need. I think that tackle is a bigger need potentially. I'm actually going to be bold here, and I'm going to have them draft Josh Simmons. I don't know if this has been drafted to them very much, but Simmons was looking very, very good before his injury. And, you know, we're going to address the O-line right away with that. I think it's important to, you know, kind of, you know, get ahead on that sort of thing. Now looking at, you know, round 2, or we obviously have a pick here and then a pick and a couple picks here and that sort of thing. I think that, you know, you could double down on edge right here and really kind of solidify that room with a couple of youngsters. I'm going to say Princely. I know I've been very high on him in the second round, and he seems to, you know, drop to the 50s, which I think is kind of wild. And then I'm also going to go, though, I'm going to grab Jack Sawyer. You know, so we're double downing on edge, you know, and that's no longer really a need, in my opinion. Getting to pick 82 here, we have Trey Harris, who I do like. He's a taller guy and, you know, would definitely be, you know, a guy that it is alluring to any sort of team. Obviously missed some time, but, you know, does a very good job against man and does a very good job in that regard. I know they don't say it's a need, but it's like Cooper Kupp hasn't been healthy that much. Marcus Valdes-Scantling can be, you know, kind of, I mean, he can be a boom to your offense and that sort of thing, but he's not going to be that guy that's going to be a high target guy. You know, so besides JSN, who are you going to really kind of milk the ball to? And Cooper Kupp could obviously just be your situational where it's like, let's get him open on third down, a guy we can trust. I am going to go with Trey Harris right here, and we're going to look to address a lot of O-line with these, you know, sort of future picks. We have Tate Ratledge here. I actually would love this pick for them, you know, and that sort of thing, a guy who can play guard at a high level. And then we go and we have, you know, this pick right here at 137, a compensatory at the end of the 4th. I personally think that, you know, looking at some of the QBs later, I think that you do look at it kind of a developmental prospect type of thing. I think that Quinn Ewers is one of the best to kind of look at for that, because it's like a lot of these later guys just have a lot of issues. And I think that Quinn Ewers, or, you know, even is Dylan Gabriel, I think he's not younger, and that's what you'd be kind of looking for. You know, you'd be looking for kind of one of these guys who's a project, and it's like looking at this, a lot of these guys are older, you know, in this draft, and it's like, you know, it's just one of those things that's like, if you're going to draft a guy who's developmental, you're maybe going to go for a dude who's just, you know, younger, which is Quinn Ewers. He's 22, just turned 22. So it's like, even if he sits for a couple years, he's still 24, 25, which is young for a QB. And obviously the deal they signed Darnold to was a 3-year deal, you know, and they could have him as a reliable backup. I guess I didn't even bother to look at who their backup for QB is. It's Sam Howell, which I just don't foresee him kind of, you know, being a guy that they're like, oh, this is going to be our project dude for a few years. I think that Howell is kind of past that age, and you know what you're getting from him. Obviously, yeah, I guess if you're waiting 2 years, you know, he's still the age of like some of these draftees, but, you know, overall, I just think it's one of those things. I'm going to go out kind of on a limb here, and I'm going to draft Quinn Ewers to have him sit. And then it's like maybe you try to dish Howell to a team who did have starting experience a couple years ago and, you know, seemingly had the trust of the Commanders back then. Who knows if another team would give him that trust. Now with our draft picks, we've obviously drafted a couple of O-line, you know, a QB, double edge, and a wide receiver, all things I think this team needs. I think Seth McLaughlin here, you know, great pickup, perfect time to draft him as well. We obviously have another pick right here, you know, type of thing. And, We have Logan Brown. Do we have anybody else that's kind of like Emory Jones? Maybe John Williams, I think, is a guy that I really like. Great size, great length, big sort of mauler. Isn't as good in the run, which is kind of odd with a big, strong guy like this. Did play a lot of left tackle, but I'm sure could move to right, and that sort of thing. Potentially, but it's like we look at kind of, John Williams. Emory Jones is, a guy who's also bigger, taller, strong type of player, and he did play right tackle. So it's like maybe we do go this guy, even though, his numbers, his grade doesn't really scream anything special, but he hasn't let up. He has let up some hurries, but not a lot of sacks. Which I think if you're not letting the QB get hit a lot, is pretty good. And, we're going to take him at the spot to maybe fill in at right tackle. Now we have a couple picks remaining. I know I'm kind of blazing through this, but who do we have, right here in round 7, with a couple of our, picks remaining. I think you kind of look maybe to draft a safety. I know there are some safeties at this, in the later rounds that it's like that I like. Oh my goodness, no. And maybe cornerback. Like I said, it's kind of one of those things. Maybe you look at linebacker as well. I'm just trying to see, who would be good here. We obviously don't have a ton of positions, players at their positions and that sort of thing. We got Craig Woodson, we do have Shiloh Sanders, which could be an interesting, sort of thing, here. Missed tackle isn't that good, but he does have forced incompletion rate very well. And it's like maybe he can be a developmental prospect. Still not a ton of missed tackles and a lot of like run defensive snaps played, and that sort of thing. A guy that can move around, only really didn't play corner, this last year. Did play a lot deep though. So it's like looking at this, I think that we're going to go ahead and we're actually going to grab, Sanders as a need at safety for some depth, hopefully. Looking here, there's a few things we could look at. I think we're going to look at wide receiver, linebacker, and that's going to be sort of thing. I don't think I'm going to go Jalen Walker for them just because I do think that they could use another sort of wide receiver. And I'm going to... I'm going to pick a guy who, I'm going to look at Rock Taylor again. I think that Rock Taylor could come in and fill that kind of big role, for them, much like, even though obviously they got MVS, who is a taller guy, and then Trey Harris is also 6'3". I think a guy that's like your contested catch, like dominator, type of thing in the red zone. Stand at 6'3", but maybe we look elsewhere. I do think that they really need kind of a linebacker, and we're gonna look there. I don't know much about Reed. This guy, missed tackle rate above average, that good. 4.5 isn't bad. Can work on that. Coverage grade isn't the best. I know. Oh, and he's a smaller player. We'll look for a guy who's maybe of a better size type of thing. 5% here, not terrible. Played in the box, obviously, mostly has a decent coverage grade, I guess, and tackles, assisted tackle. Did miss some time this last year. Jalen Walker, we all know that is a guy that I really like, that you can also use him for pass rush. I personally think that it's like with who we've drafted for pass rush and who they've brought in, that's why I kind of am like, would they grab a guy like Jalen Walker? And it's just like, I'm really trying to find that kind of most value for their final pick type of thing. And you know what? We're going to keep going down the list. I kind of want a guy who's more of a typical big body man, like a Bobby Wagner, that sort of thing. It just doesn't look like there is any of that. Here. So let's just kind of look at who's available. And it's like, we went Shiloh Sanders. Otherwise, I might say go Craig Woodson or something like that. I think that... You know what? We might just do this, and we might just draft Jalen Walker. I really would like, I wouldn't mind it. A blitzing linebacker, I guess, for them, but they already have kind of a, and that sort of thing. They do say to draft Malachi Starks here. I think that's entirely possible. I don't know if McDonald would value a safety as much as like Carroll would, with a guy like Earl Thomas back in the day, and then other things like that. But overall, top 48% of drafts. I think this is a good solid draft for them. We obviously didn't grab like a corner. I think they would be fine to not draft one of those. But it's like 4 linemen, which I think is their biggest need. I mean, you need to be able to protect Sam Darnold, and you don't want him to potentially be unprotected, in his first year when he was behind a pretty good O-line last year. I know that some people knocked on the Vikings O-line, but it was not that bad. So, with that being said, tell me what you would change or who you would want, in your drafts for the Seattle Seahawks, if you have any takes on that. Obviously Quinn Ewers could be, a pick that we could evaluate a lot more. I think that it's one of those things that it's like, it may not happen this year, but it's like, if Darnold doesn't really pan out, they're not like handcuffed to him because they're not paying him a ton of money. But it's like, you don't want to look at a quarterback in like a couple of years when it's like Darnold's final year, or something like that, when it's like this team, it should be a short rebuild for them if they draft correctly and that sort of thing. But Quinn Ewers could still be a very good backup, more than goodness, I forget his name. But with that being said, that'll be the end of this video. Please leave a like, comment and subscribe if you like this. We're going all the way, not all the way to the NFL draft, but soon we'll be doing our top, 10 or top 5 lists. After I finish these 7-round mock drafts with, not just a handful of teams to go, but as always, go Pack, go.